I never imagined I'd be telling this story, but here I am, years after the fact, ready to reveal why humanity never set foot on Mars again. My name, now long forgotten by most, is Marcus Hale. Once upon a time, I was an astronaut, part of NASA's elite. I was chosen to embark on a mission so secret, so buried in lies, that most don't even know it existed. The truth has been erased from history, and those of us who were part of it have either disappeared or, in my case, been forced into silence. But today, I no longer care about the consequences. I have nothing left to lose, and the world deserves to know what happened. In 1999, NASA launched a covert mission to Mars under the codename Ayres-1. It wasn't publicized like Apollo or any other mission. Officially, it never happened. But I was there. I lived it. We were told that the mission's purpose was to test the feasibility of human colonization, a stepping stone for future manned missions to the Red Planet. It was a lie. What we encountered on Mars was nothing like the mission briefings, and the truth has been covered up for decades. 5 of us were chosen for Ayres-1. The best of the best, they said. I remember the day we were summoned to a top-level briefing. They made it sound like an honor being selected for the mission that would push humanity further into the stars than ever before. They didn't tell us about the risks, though, or at least not the real ones. Looking back, I should have questioned everything: the secrecy, the intense psychological evaluations, the fact that our families weren't even allowed to know where we were going. Our team consisted of me, Marcus Hale, a former fighter pilot and seasoned astronaut, Dr. Sarah Mendez, a brilliant biologist with a focus on extraterrestrial life forms, Captain John Harris, a by-the-book mission commander, Ortiz, a geologist who had been studying Mars for years, and Thompson, our engineer and problem solver. Together, we represented humanity's finest, a hand-picked group sent to explore the unknown. But none of us were prepared for what we'd find. From the moment we launched, something felt wrong. The atmosphere was tense. Harris, usually composed, seemed uneasy. Mendez kept quiet, her face buried in her notes, and Ortiz, who never stopped talking, was unusually silent. The briefing had been vague, especially when it came to specifics about Mars itself. They kept repeating the same line: stick to the mission objectives, no deviations. We were halfway to Mars when the first sign of trouble hit. We lost communication with mission control. At first, we thought it was a temporary glitch, solar flares maybe, or cosmic interference. But as the hours passed and we tried every trick in the book to restore the connection, it became clear. Someone or something didn't want us in contact with Earth. That should have been our first clue to turn around, but Harris pushed on. He had his orders, and Harris never questioned orders. The closer we got to Mars, the worse things became. Equipment started malfunctioning at random: navigation systems, life support monitors, things that shouldn't have been affected by space travel. Yet, there we were, watching as one by one our systems failed. And then came the dreams. I started having nightmares about Mars even before we arrived. I saw things that shouldn't exist on a lifeless planet. Monstrous figures, shadows moving across the barren landscape, watching us. At first, I thought it was just the stress of the mission getting to me. But then the others started having the same dreams. It wasn't just in our heads. By the time we reached orbit, the tension had escalated to outright fear. None of us said it, but we were all thinking the same thing. Something was waiting for us down there. Harris, however, was unwavering. "We have a mission to complete," he barked at us during a team meeting. "No one is backing out." We began the descent to the Martian surface. The ship shuddered violently as we passed through the thin atmosphere. The storms on Mars were supposed to be predictable, minor disruptions. But what we encountered was no ordinary storm. It was like the planet itself was rejecting us. The red sand whipped against the hull and the wind howled like a living creature. Visibility was zero, and yet Harris insisted we push forward. We touched down, not where we were supposed to. Our navigation systems had gone haywire during the descent, and instead of landing near the designated research site, we found ourselves in an uncharted region of Mars. As the dust cleared and we finally got a look at our surroundings, I realized just how wrong everything was. Mars wasn't supposed to have structures. It wasn't supposed to have life. But there, standing before us, was a massive black tower. It was ancient, made of a material I had never seen before, and yet it was completely intact, untouched by time or the elements. "What the hell is that?" Thompson muttered, his voice trembling. None of us answered. There were no answers. Harris tried to regain control of the situation. "We stick to the mission. We gather our samples and return to the ship. We're not here to investigate anything else." But how could we ignore it? That tower wasn't natural, and deep down we all knew it. Something was watching us from inside. We could feel it. It was like the ground itself was vibrating beneath our feet, pulsing with an energy I couldn't explain. But Harris, true to his military training, ignored our fear. "We don't deviate," he repeated like a mantra. So we obeyed. We suited up and stepped onto the surface. The storm had calmed, but the silence was worse. It was the kind of silence that presses down on you, making you feel small and insignificant. The tower loomed over us, casting a long, dark shadow across the landscape. We should have turned back then, but we didn't. We walked toward the tower, our curiosity getting the better of us. It was Thompson who first heard the humming, a low, steady vibration that seemed to emanate from the ground. "You hear that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper over the comms. I heard it too. We all did. The hum grew louder as we approached the tower. It wasn't a sound that could be described in any conventional way, more like a feeling deep in the bones, a vibration that rattled the inside of your skull and made your teeth ache. The ground beneath our feet was cold, far colder than it should have been for a planet bathed in sunlight all day long. Mars was supposed to be dead, barren, a world of dust and rock. But here, in the shadow of the tower, it felt alive in a way I couldn't comprehend. Captain Harris kept his eyes forward, marching like a soldier trained to ignore the strange and the terrifying. But I could see the tension in his posture, the way his hands gripped his equipment just a little too tightly. He was scared. We all were. Thompson, the engineer, stopped in his tracks about halfway to the tower. "Something's not right," he muttered, glancing at the readings on his suit's display. "Temperature's dropping fast. This place isn't supposed to be cold." "Keep moving," Harris ordered, his voice sharp. "We gather our samples and leave. No deviations, remember?" But how could we focus on samples when there was something undeniably wrong with this place? Dr. Mendez, our biologist, was staring at the tower like she was in a trance, her fingers twitching nervously around the straps of her equipment. "There's no way this is natural," she whispered. "It's too perfect." The tower loomed impossibly tall, jet black against the crimson sky. There were no markings on its surface, no signs of wear or erosion. It was as if it had been built yesterday, untouched by the passage of time. As we stood there looking up at it, the hum in the air grew stronger. It was a low, thrumming pulse, almost like a heartbeat, and the closer we got, the more it felt like the planet itself was watching us. We finally reached the base of the tower. Up close, it was even more unsettling. The material it was made from didn't match anything in our databases. Thompson ran a scanner over it, but the device started glitching out, spitting back nonsense readings. "What the hell?" he muttered, shaking the scanner in frustration. "This thing's not making any sense." "Maybe it's broken," Harris said, though I could tell from his expression that he didn't believe it. "No, it's not broken," Thompson insisted. It's being interfered with. There's some kind of energy field around this thing." Before any of us could respond, there was a sound. A soft, almost melodic whisper that seemed to come from inside the tower. I whipped my head around looking for the source, but there was nothing. Just the endless Martian desert stretching out in every direction. "Did you hear that?" Mendez asked, her voice barely audible. "Hear what?" Harris snapped, clearly on edge. "That whisper, like someone's talking." "No one's talking," Harris said, but his voice was shaky. "Focus on the mission." We started collecting samples, but it was clear none of us were paying much attention to what we were doing. The tower was the only thing any of us could think about. I found myself drawn to it, almost compelled to touch its surface. My gloved hand hovered inches from the black material, and I swear I could feel it vibrating, like it was alive. "Don't touch it," Mendez warned, her eyes wide with fear. "We don't know what it is." I pulled my hand back, but the strange feeling didn't go away. It was like the tower was speaking to me, whispering in the back of my mind, trying to tell me something in a language I couldn't understand. The hum in the air had become a steady thrumming now, resonating through my entire body. I felt dizzy, nauseous, like the world around me was warping and bending in ways it shouldn't. That's when Thompson screamed. We all turned at once, and what I saw chilled me to the core. Thompson was standing at the foot of the tower, his back to us, but he was staring straight up, his face hidden beneath his visor. He was frozen in place, his body rigid and unmoving. And then, slowly, he turned toward us. His eyes, God, I'll never forget his eyes. They were wide and glassy, like he was seeing something none of us could. His mouth was moving, but no sound was coming out. And then finally, in a voice that wasn't his own, he spoke. "It's waiting." I felt my blood run cold. There was something inside the tower, something ancient, something terrible. Thompson's voice didn't sound human. It was too deep, too distorted, like 1,000 voices speaking at once. Harris rushed toward him, grabbing him by the shoulders and shaking him. "Thompson, snap out of it." But Thompson didn't respond. He just kept staring up at the tower, his body swaying like he was in a trance. And then, without warning, he collapsed. His body hit the ground hard, the dust kicking up around him. "Thompson!" Mendez screamed, rushing to his side. I knelt down beside him, checking for a pulse, but there was nothing. His heart had stopped. His skin was cold, far too cold for someone in a fully functional spacesuit. It was like something had drained the life out of him. "We need to get him back to the ship," I yelled, panic rising in my chest. But as I looked up, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The door to the tower, the one we hadn't even noticed before, was now open. A dark, gaping maw leading into the unknown. And from inside, that same low hum was calling to us, pulling us in. Harris stood frozen, staring at the entrance. His hand twitched toward his helmet like he was considering removing it, but then he snapped back to reality. "We're leaving," he ordered, his voice shaking. "Now." We grabbed Thompson's body and started dragging him back toward the ship. But as we moved, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Something inside that tower had its eyes on us, and it wasn't going to let us leave so easily. As we made our way across the barren landscape, the wind picked up again, howling through the empty plains. And in that wind, I could hear it, the whispering. It was louder now, almost insistent, like it was trying to get inside my head. I wanted to cover my ears to block it out, but I couldn't. It was everywhere, in the air, in the ground, in my mind. We had awakened something that had been sleeping for centuries, maybe even longer. And now it was hungry. The journey back to the ship was a blur of panic and desperation. We dragged Thompson's lifeless body across the cold Martian soil, but the further we got from the tower, the heavier the air felt, as if an invisible force was pressing down on us, trying to keep us from leaving. Every step felt like wading through thick water, our suits heavy and uncooperative. My breath came in ragged gasps, not from exertion, but from the terror gnawing at my insides. Behind us, the tower loomed, silent and patient, like a predator watching its prey. The hum that had filled the air near its base now followed us, a low, rhythmic pulse that seemed to grow stronger the further we moved away. It was almost as if the tower knew we were trying to escape, and it wasn't happy about it. Harris was a few feet ahead, his grip tight on Thompson's limp arm as he yanked him across the ground. Mendez followed close behind, her eyes wide, darting around as if she expected something to leap out from the shadows and drag us back to that cursed tower. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting the door to the tower to slam shut or for something, anything, to come crawling out of that dark opening. But it remained open, a gaping black maw, and that made it worse. It was waiting. "Move faster!" Harris barked, his voice strained with panic. But none of us could go any quicker. The weight of Thompson's body and the invisible pressure pushing against us made it feel like we were moving in slow motion. The ship was only a few hundred meters away now, but it might as well have been on the other side of the planet. Every inch closer we got, the more I could feel it. That oppressive, suffocating presence. It wasn't just the tower anymore. There was something else, something out there in the darkness, watching us. I could feel its eyes on me, cold and calculating, as if deciding what to do with us. "We're not alone," Mendez muttered, barely loud enough for me to hear. Her voice trembled and I could see the fear in her eyes. "We need to keep going," I said, trying to sound confident, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince her or myself. "We'll be safe once we're inside the ship." "Safe?" Mendez laughed bitterly. "Do you really think we'll be safe? Look at him." She pointed at Thompson, his body dragging limply across the ground. "Whatever that thing is, it killed him. It's not going to let us leave." I didn't have an answer for her. She wasn't wrong. Thompson hadn't just died. Something had taken his life. It had drained him, stolen the energy from his body like some kind of parasite. And I had a sinking feeling that it wasn't finished with us. Suddenly, Thompson's body twitched. Harris and I both stopped staring down at him in horror. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, his fingers began to curl and uncurl, the movement unnatural and jerky, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. "Harris," I whispered, but he was already backing away, his eyes wide with disbelief. Thompson's head snapped up. His eyes, those same wide, glassy eyes, locked onto me, and I felt my stomach drop. His mouth moved, but no sound came out at first. Then, in a voice that was not his own, a guttural, rasping whisper filled the air. "Return." My blood ran cold. The word hung in the air, thick and heavy. It wasn't just a command, it was a threat. Harris dropped Thompson's arm, stumbling back. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, his voice tinged with desperation. "He's dead. He's been dead for hours." But Thompson's body continued to move, twitching and convulsing, his eyes never leaving mine. Then, in one quick, jerky motion, he rose to his feet, his limbs moving in unnatural ways, as if they no longer belonged to him. "Return," the voice said again, louder this time. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't Thompson anymore. Whatever was controlling him, it was something far darker, far older. It had taken him, and now it wanted us. Harris drew his sidearm, his hand shaking as he pointed it at the thing that had once been our friend. "Stay back," he warned, but there was no authority in his voice, just fear. Thompson, or whatever was inside him, tilted its head almost curious like it was studying us, and then it lunged. Harris fired 3 shots in quick succession, the sound deafening in the silence of Mars. The bullets hit Thompson square in the chest, but he didn't even flinch. He kept coming, faster now, his movements erratic and violent like a marionette with its strings tangled. "Run!" Harris shouted, but I was already moving, dragging Mendez with me as we bolted toward the ship. I could hear the sound of Thompson's footsteps pounding behind us, closing in faster than should have been possible. We reached the ramp of the ship, and Harris slammed his fist against the control panel, forcing the door open. "Get inside!" he yelled, shoving Mendez up the ramp. I turned just in time to see Thompson, no, the thing that had taken him, leap toward us, its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. Harris fired again, but it was too late. Thompson's body collided with him, knocking the gun from his hand. They both tumbled to the ground, Thompson's fingers clawing at Harris's suit, trying to tear it open. "Harris!" I screamed, but there was nothing I could do. Mendez pulled me inside the ship, her face pale with terror. "We have to seal the door." "But Harris—" "We can't save him," she cried, slamming her hand against the panel to close the ramp. I watched in horror as the door slid shut, cutting off my view of Harris and the creature. His screams echoed through the ship, then were suddenly cut off, replaced by the hum of the ship's systems coming online. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, the hum from outside began to build again, louder this time, more insistent. And in the distance, through the small window of the ship, I could see it, the tower. Its door was still open, and from its depths I could feel something stirring, something ancient and hungry. We weren't safe. Not yet. The hum outside the ship seemed to vibrate through the walls, growing louder with every passing second. It wasn't just a sound, it was something more insidious, something that crawled into your bones and twisted its way through your thoughts, making it impossible to think straight. I could feel it pressing down on us, like a weight in the air, a malevolent presence that surrounded the ship and refused to let us go. Mendez stood by the controls, her face pale, her hands trembling. She had sealed the door, but we both knew that wasn't enough. The thing that had taken Thompson was still out there, and it was only a matter of time before it found a way in. "We have to take off," Mendez said, her voice tight with panic. "We need to get off this planet right now." I nodded, my mind racing. The mission was over. Whatever we had come here to do was lost. There was no salvaging it now, no going back to the tower, no retrieving the data. All that mattered was getting away from whatever was out there. Mendez's fingers flew across the console as she prepped the engines for takeoff. Outside, the hum continued to grow, almost deafening now, as if the planet itself was vibrating with rage. I glanced out the window, half expecting to see the tower rising from the ground, reaching out to drag us back. Then, just as the engines roared to life, the ship lurched violently to one side. I stumbled, grabbing onto a railing for support. What the hell was that? Mendez's eyes widened as she looked at the console. Something's pulling us back. Before she could finish, the ship jerked again, harder this time, sending us both crashing to the floor. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing. The lights flickered, and the hum outside the ship turned into a full-blown roar, like the wail of 1,000 voices all screaming in unison. Mendez clung to the console, her fingers white-knuckled as she tried to stabilize the ship. "We're not going to make it," she shouted over the noise. "It's got us." "What's got us?" I yelled back, though I already knew the answer. Something from the tower. Something from that cursed place. Whatever we had disturbed, whatever Thompson had encountered, it wasn't just going to let us leave. It was dragging us back, pulling us into its dark, twisted grasp. Suddenly, the lights in the ship went out, plunging us into complete darkness. The only sound was the roar outside and the pounding of my heart in my ears. "Mendez!" I shouted, but there was no response. Then, from the blackness, came a voice, a low, guttural whisper that sent chills down my spine. "Return." I froze. The voice was coming from the console, from the ship's communication system, but it wasn't a signal. It wasn't anything human. It was the same voice we had heard in Thompson, that horrible, rasping command. "Return," it said again, louder this time. I stumbled back, my hands shaking. "Mendez, we have to—" Before I could finish, the lights flickered back on and I saw her. She was standing at the console, her back to me, her hands still gripping the controls. But something was wrong. Her head was tilted at an odd angle, her neck twisted in a way that no human body could manage. And when she turned to face me, I saw her eyes. They were blank, just like Thompson's had been. Empty, lifeless, yet filled with that same otherworldly malice. "Mendez," I whispered, my voice trembling. She opened her mouth, but it wasn't her voice that came out. It was that same terrible whisper, that alien command. "Return." I backed away, my heart pounding. This wasn't Mendez anymore. She was gone, just like Thompson, taken by whatever force had come from the tower. Whatever was inside her, it wanted us to go back. Back to the tower, back to the nightmare we had barely escaped. But I wasn't going back. I couldn't. I spun around and ran for the door, my mind racing. The ship was compromised. Mendez was gone and the ship was being dragged back to the tower. There was only one option left. As insane as it seemed, I had to abandon the ship. The door controls were still functional, and with shaking hands I unlocked the airlock. The door slid open with a hiss, and I felt the cold Martian air flood in. Outside, the red sand swirled violently in the wind, and the hum from the tower was deafening now, shaking the ground beneath my feet. I hesitated for just a moment, glancing back at Mendez. She was still standing at the console, her eyes fixed on me, her mouth moving silently as she repeated that terrible command, "Return." Without another thought, I jumped out of the ship. The impact with the ground knocked the air from my lungs, but I forced myself to my feet, ignoring the searing pain in my side. The ship was only a few meters away, its engines still roaring, but it wasn't moving. Whatever was pulling it back had anchored it to the ground, and there was no escaping that force. I looked around, trying to figure out what to do next. I had no plan, no direction. All I knew was that I had to get away from the ship, away from the tower, away from whatever had taken my crew. But the moment I took a step forward, I felt it. That same pressure, that same invisible force pressing down on me. It was as if the planet itself was trying to stop me, to hold me in place. The hum from the tower grew louder, filling my head, drowning out my thoughts. My vision blurred, and I stumbled, falling to my knees in the sand. "No," I gasped, struggling to breathe. Then, in the distance, I saw them. Figures moving across the sand, their shapes distorted and shifting. At first, I thought they were hallucinations, tricks of the light. But as they got closer, I realized what they were. They were us. I saw Thompson, his lifeless body dragging across the ground, his eyes fixed on me. Behind him was Mendez, her neck twisted at that impossible angle, her arms reaching out toward me. And there were others, dozens of them. Figures I didn't recognize, all moving in the same eerie, jerky way, their blank eyes staring at me with cold, empty malice. They were coming for me. And as I watched them advance, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't leaving this planet alive. I watched in frozen horror as the figures approached, dragging themselves across the red sands of Mars with an eerie, unnatural gait. Their forms shimmered in the haze of the planet's thin atmosphere, as if they were nothing more than phantoms, or perhaps something worse. Thompson was at the front of the procession, his eyes locked on mine, but it was no longer him. There was nothing left of the man who had once been my colleague, my friend. Behind him, Mendez stumbled forward, her body contorted, her face a twisted mask of blank terror. And yet, as horrifying as her appearance was, it was the others that truly filled me with dread. I didn't recognize them, but I knew instinctively that they had once been like us, explorers, astronauts, scientists. Each one had likely come here searching for answers, only to meet the same fate. Their blank, dead eyes followed me as they drew closer, their feet dragging through the red dust, as if the planet itself were pulling them along. I tried to move, to flee, but my body refused to cooperate. The pressure in the air, the same malevolent force that had gripped our ship, seemed to intensify with each passing second, rooting me to the spot. "Get up!" I screamed at myself, my voice little more than a hoarse whisper. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of my own panicked breathing filling my helmet. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away as possible, but I was paralyzed by terror and the unseen force. The hum from the tower, deafening now, vibrated through the ground, through my bones. It was inside my head, gnawing at my thoughts, distorting everything. I gritted my teeth, trying to focus, trying to block it out, but it was like fighting a rising tide. The ground beneath me felt unstable, as though it might crumble away at any moment, dragging me down into the cold, alien soil. Through the swirling dust, the figures drew closer, their movements slow but relentless. And as they came nearer, I could see them more clearly, their hollow faces, their bodies twisted and broken in ways no human should endure. Their mouths hung open as if they were silently screaming, but no sound emerged. I was going to die here, I realized, or worse, become one of them. With a surge of desperation, I forced my legs to move. The first step was agony, my muscles screaming in protest, but I pushed forward, stumbling across the uneven terrain. Every step felt like I was wading through quicksand, but I couldn't stop. Not now. The figures were nearly upon me. I could feel their presence like a cold wind at my back. I didn't dare look behind me, not again. Instead, I fixed my eyes on the horizon, on the faint outline of the base, barely visible through the dust storm. If I could just make it there, if I could get inside, I might have a chance. The air was thin, each breath a struggle. My vision blurred, the red landscape swimming before my eyes. I was running on pure instinct now, my thoughts a tangled mess of fear and adrenaline. My only goal was to escape, to outrun whatever was coming for me. But the weight in the air seemed to grow heavier with each step, like an invisible hand pressing down on me. The tower's hum was unbearable now, a deep, resonant vibration that pulsed through the very core of the planet. I couldn't think, couldn't focus. The world around me had become a nightmare, a swirling vortex of red sand, darkness, and death. Suddenly, I tripped, my boot catching on something buried in the sand. I hit the ground hard, the impact jarring every bone in my body. Pain shot through my side, but I forced myself to roll over, gasping for air. That's when I saw it. A hand, skeletal, twisted, reaching out of the sand just inches from my face. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I had stumbled over. It was another body, half buried in the Martian soil, long dead. The remnants of a spacesuit clung to its bony frame, but the visor had long since shattered, leaving the skull exposed to the elements. I scrambled backward, my heart racing, but as I pushed myself to my feet, I saw that there were more, dozens of them. Bodies, partially buried in the sand, hidden beneath the surface. Some had been there for years, maybe decades, their suits faded and torn, their bones bleached white by the planet's harsh conditions. How many had come here before us? How many had died, their bodies left to rot in the endless Martian dust? And worse, how many had been dragged back just like Thompson, just like Mendez? I couldn't breathe. My lungs burned, my vision spinning as I stumbled forward away from the horror. The ground beneath me felt unsteady, as if the planet itself was shifting, moving beneath my feet. I had to get away, had to escape. But no matter how far I ran, the weight of the planet seemed to follow me, pressing down, dragging me back. Suddenly, I felt a cold grip on my ankle. I screamed, kicking wildly, but the hand held fast, pulling me down into the sand. I twisted around, expecting to see one of the figures, one of the dead, but it wasn't them. It was the hand of the buried astronaut, its skeletal fingers locked around my boot, pulling me toward the ground. "Let go," I shouted, panic rising in my throat. But the hand wouldn't release me. It was as if the planet itself had come alive, determined to pull me under, to claim me as its own. The sand shifted beneath me, and I could feel myself sinking, my legs disappearing into the ground as the pressure increased. I thrashed wildly, my hands clawing at the ground, trying to find something, anything to hold onto. But the sand was too loose, too unstable. It shifted and swirled around me, pulling me deeper and deeper, until I was almost completely submerged. I was going to die here. I was going to be buried in the sand, just like the others. Just another body lost to the madness of Mars. With one final, desperate effort, I reached out, my fingers brushing against something solid, something metal. I grabbed hold of it, my fingers slipping on the cold surface, but I held on with all my strength. Slowly, painfully, I pulled myself free, dragging my body out of the sand, inch by inch. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't stop to think. I just ran. The figures were still behind me, still coming, but I didn't care. All that mattered was getting to the base, getting away from this cursed planet before it swallowed me whole. The tower loomed in the distance, its dark spire piercing the blood-red sky. And though every step was agony, I kept moving. Because if I stopped, if I hesitated for even a second, I knew I would never leave this planet alive. The base was just ahead, its cold, sterile walls looming like a sanctuary in the distance. My legs were barely holding me up, every muscle screaming in protest, but I couldn't stop. The figures were behind me, relentless and silent, closing in with every step I took. I couldn't let them catch me, not after everything I'd seen, not after what this planet had already done to my crew. I stumbled toward the airlock, my vision blurring as I reached out, slamming my hand against the panel. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a hiss of decompressing air, the door slid open, and I collapsed inside, gasping for breath. I slammed the door shut just as the first of the figures reached the threshold, its face pressed against the glass. Its eyes, those lifeless, hollow eyes, stared back at me, and for a moment I thought it might break through. But it didn't. The airlock held, separating me from the horrors outside. The silence in the base was deafening compared to the howling winds and the humming of that cursed tower. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath, my mind reeling from the madness I had just escaped. I didn't have much time. I knew it. Whatever was out there, whatever was controlling those things, it wasn't finished. It wanted me too. I needed to send a message, needed to warn Earth about what had really happened here. Pushing myself to my feet, I staggered toward the command center. The lights flickered dimly, casting long, ominous shadows across the empty corridors. The base felt different now, like a tomb. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was the last living person on Mars, maybe even in this part of space. I reached the communications terminal and collapsed into the chair, my hands trembling as I punched in the emergency frequency. The console flickered to life and I began transmitting a distress signal, my voice hoarse but steady. This is Commander Daniel Harris of the Mars Mission Agathon. To anyone receiving this, I need to warn you, Mars is not what we thought. We were sent here under false pretenses. They knew something was wrong. I paused, my mind racing as I struggled to piece together the words. What could I even say that would make sense? How could I explain the horrors I had witnessed? The tower, the figures, the dead rising from the sand. It was all too much, too unreal. But I had to try. The tower, it's some kind of ancient structure, not human. It's broadcasting something, some kind of signal that gets inside your head. It's not just the planet, it's alive, or at least something in it is. The crew, my crew, they're gone. Thompson, Mendez, all of them. They're not dead, but they're not alive either. Mars took them. It's been taking people for years, maybe decades. I stopped again, my heart pounding. My thoughts were slipping away, clouded by exhaustion and fear. I could feel the presence of the tower even from here, like a distant pulse in my mind, tugging at the edges of my consciousness. I took a deep breath and forced myself to continue. Don't come back here. Do you hear me? Mars is a trap. Every mission, every crew that's disappeared, they're still here, buried in the sand. And the tower, it's calling to them. It's calling to all of us. As I spoke, I glanced at the monitors, the camera still fixed on the outside of the base. The figures were still there, circling the structure like predators stalking their prey. I could see their faces now, twisted, deformed, and grotesque. They weren't human anymore. They were something else, something Mars had remade in its own image. And that's when I realized the awful truth. Mars wasn't just killing people. It was absorbing them, using them. The tower was the key, broadcasting its signal across the planet, drawing in the living and turning them into extensions of itself. Every person who had ever set foot here, every explorer, every astronaut, They had all become part of Mars, and soon I would too. A sudden wave of dizziness hit me, and I clutched the edge of the console, struggling to stay upright. The humming was back, low and persistent, vibrating through the walls, through my bones. It was inside my head again, stronger this time, pulling at my thoughts, my memories. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to fight it off, but it was too late. I could feel it. Mars, the tower, whatever it was. It had me now. It had been with me since the moment I arrived, whispering in the back of my mind, waiting for the right moment to strike. I opened my eyes, and for a brief, terrifying second, I saw my reflection in the monitor screen. But it wasn't me. My eyes were black, my skin pale and cracked, like the faces of the figures outside. "No," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Not yet. I can't." The console beeped, interrupting my thoughts. A transmission was coming in. Someone was responding. I forced myself to focus, my hand trembling as I reached for the controls. "This is Earth Control," a voice crackled over the speakers. "Commander Harris, we received your transmission. What is your status? Repeat, what is your status?" I stared at the console, my mind spinning. Earth, they were still out there. They were listening. I could still warn them, still stop them from sending anyone else to this cursed place. But as I opened my mouth to speak, the humming grew louder, drowning out the voice on the other end. The walls of the base seemed to close in around me, the lights flickering wildly. I could feel the tower's grip tightening, pulling me under, and I knew there was no escaping it now. "This is Commander Harris," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Stay away. Don't." The lights went out. The console went dead. And in the darkness, I heard them, the figures, the dead, clawing at the walls, whispering my name. Mars had claimed me, and soon it would claim them all. The end.